In 1984, the Museum of Modern Art had a big exhibition out of close to 200 art. Now that the world...
Not the serious money that male artists get.
A woman was not even a person. It took quite a long struggle by some very determined women to change this.
Hundreds of years ago in Europe, kings and queens told us what art was, and we stuck with that. Now that the world aspires to democracy, why should billionaires and oligarchs define what our visual culture is? Isn't that backward?
What's very good about our image is that when you look at our masks, you think of what we stand for. And we stand for the conscience of the art world. And we feel that there is underrepresentation of women and minorities.
In 1984, the Museum of Modern Art had a big exhibition. Out of close to 200 artists in the show, there were only 17 women and even fewer artists of color. And it occurred to some of us that the art world was basically a white male place, and no one asked why. Well, if there are no women, there are no artists of color, it just means they're not making work that's good enough. And we knew that that was a tired excuse. There was a protest, placards and chantings and a picket line. The only thing that we accomplished was to anger visitors to the museum. We noticed it didn't work. Everyone was willing to excuse the art world. So we decided that day that we had to figure out a way to make people care. There was discrimination right in front of people's noses, but they didn't see it.
The thing is, when you tell people the system is unfair, they don't really believe you. But when you show them the numbers, there's nothing they can say to counteract that.
We started to name names in the art world. Lists of galleries and museums that didn't show women and critics that didn't write about women. We would go after every cross-section of the art world. Everyone was passing the buck to someone else. The white male artists said, I can't tell my gallery what to show. And the galleries said, well, I can't show women because their work doesn't sell. And then collectors would say, well, I can't buy women or artists of color because I don't see them. We were just angry. Art is a record of culture, and the art doesn't look like the culture, and the art is told only through the works of white males. That's basically what it is. It's the history of patriarchy, not the history of who we are. We figured out this formula that if you make people laugh, if you put people on the spot, and if you use information, you can actually change people's minds. And the only thing you can do to a system that oppresses you is to make fun of it. And we did it by being provocative.
Guerrilla girls who call themselves the conscience of the art world have plastered their answer all over town.
It was a lot of fun, especially when you're anonymous and you wear gorilla masks. Everyone can own a poster of ours.
We want to talk in a way that people can digest easily, and we want to produce something that everybody can be part of.
I'd be happier to know that we have posters in millions of college dorm rooms than hanging over the couch of some billionaire art collector.
I'm going to stop it there. So they started to just get to it, and I thought that they would finish it there, because I've watched most of that before, but I didn't get to the end. So the Guerrilla Girls is a group of female activists. They are artists, they are curators, they are gallerists, so people who work in galleries. They are basically women connected with the art world. And so they wear those gorilla masks to remain anonymous. And it's really funny because I know one of the commentators, I recognize her voice. She's the very famous photographer, Sally Mann, who's kind of notorious for photographing images of her children. Interesting that I actually recognize, even though she's got a mask on her face. But what they will do is they will go to places like the Venice Biennial, which I mentioned before when we looked at Kusuma, this major art exhibit, and they will make points to point out how few women as well as other minorities are represented in the art world. And so they're pretty notorious for the kinds of posters that they make and they print. Sometimes they do them in flyer form, billboard. Obviously now they post a lot on social media. And so the advantages of being a female artist or a woman artist, working without the pressures of success, right? And so obviously there's a big running list of things that women artists really don't have to worry about because they are underrepresented in the art world. So I know that they showed quite a few of these in the video, so I don't really want to dwell on them. But you could research the Guerrilla Girls if you're really interested in seeing other posters and information from them. Right? So in the 70s with that women's movement, there was a series of women who were working, not just in the art world making art about themselves, but they were also making art about movement. And so a very famous collaboration under the artist Judy Chicago. This is a table, and the table is in the form of a triangle, which is basically a symbol of like a witch's coven, and it actually has dinner settings. So it was like a lot of it is like typical female work, things that are kind of like crafts or kind of art forms that women are kind of known for. So there's a lot of textile arts and ceramics and pottery and painting. And so what they did is they took important historical figures of women and they made like table settings for them. So basically we have 13 women times 3 on all three sides of the triangle, and it represents them and their place in history. And then it's kind of set on top of a floor that has the names of even more female artists and poets and writers and art creative in women's history. A lot of the place settings have kind of female genitalia-like imagery, which is pretty typical of the women's movement, right? Kind of emphasizing the sort of feminine qualities of work. So Judy Chicago basically was like the designer, the mastermind of it, but she had a lot of artists working on this collaboration. It's in the Brooklyn Museum in New York if you're interested in ever going to see it. The artist that we have next, who's in the 250, is Cindy Sherman. And so is there anything odd about her subject matter in each of her works? I'm going to show you a few. So I want you to see if you think that there's anything odd about the subject matter that she photographs. Okay, maybe that's a little bit too odd. Right? Anyone that recognize anything strange? They're all images of her, right? And so what Cindy Sherman does is she takes on persona. She takes on her, like she dresses herself up in costumes, in masks, in makeup, in wigs, and she photographs herself. And so in the work, she often plays on female stereotypes. So she has a whole series based on like B movie actresses. So B movies would be like on Netflix when you watch a movie where it doesn't have like a recognizable name of an actor or an actress. People you don't really know. And so often these kind of black and white B movies of like the 1960s and 70s were very dramatic, almost soap opera-like. So she kind of poses herself in very dramatic sort of ways. And she likes to exploit on stereotypes of women. So like the damsel in distress, right? The woman who is, taking care of the household, but she's still strong. The woman who's waiting for the phone call for the man that she loves, right? And in these early pieces, she intentionally made them seem grainy. Like she wanted them to look like they're old. She wanted them to look like they're vintage. She wanted them to look like they're not the greatest quality. So they look like this lesser quality of movie. They're weak movies. So they almost have kind of like a video still kind of feeling. When you look at this scene, you feel like it's been ripped out of a movie, right? But it's really just a photograph. But she's done series, other series as well, where she plays on other female other notions. She has a strange series on clowns. And the series that we're looking at is really a series that she made when she was in Rome. She studied and worked out of Rome for about a year. And in that time when she was working out of Rome, she really was doing kind of like updates. So remember how Manet would do updates of paintings, right? She basically would do these updates of like Renaissance Baroque paintings. So these are also portraits of her, right? And this is what Cindy Sherman looks like. So you can see that she really does apply a lot of makeup and prosthetics and wigs to kind of transform herself. But what I think is really interesting is when she transforms herself, it's obvious it's fake. Okay, so I want to make sure we say that. It's obvious it's fake. It's not good makeup. It's not good costume. It's not good wigs, right? It's really kind of made to look like she is dressing up, right? It's meant to exploit the fact that this is fake, right? So I shouldn't say it, but I think the very strange piece that they've included in the 250 is Untitled. So it doesn't have a name, but it's number 228, and it's from the History of Portrait series. So number 231. And so does anyone know what famous character or what famous paintings she is acknowledging in this image? Anyone have any guess? I might have to pull back into the recesses of our art history brains. Sadly, not a piece that's in the 250. Right? She is basically looking at the Judith and Holofernes portraits or paintings that we saw in the Baroque time, right? So Caravaggio, who's in the 250, but this is not his piece in the 250, remember that in the Old Testament, there's a series of books that aren't included in the typical Bible, and one of them is the book of Judith. And in the book of Judith, remember how she basically uses her womanly wiles, right, to seduce an Assyrian general, right? So she's seducing an Assyrian general. She brings him into her household, and then her and her maid decapitate him and kill him and save her people, right? So she's retelling that story, right? But when we look at it, right, why is she retelling this story in such a strange sort of way, right? Right? When we look at traditional paintings of Judith, right? Caravaggio, Artemisia Gentileschi, they're not always done in this, there's kind of different ways that it's depicted. And this image on the left is one that they included in the Smart History article on Cindy Sherman in this piece. And let's look at the costuming and the style of painting, right? We have these Baroque pieces, right? These are like 16th, 17th century paintings. When we look at them, do we think Judith would have worn this outfit when killing Holofernes? Think about the time. Would she be wearing this time before, this is all BC, right? This is BC time. Would she be wearing these clothing? No. This is like 16th, 17th century Judith, right? She's wearing contemporary clothing. She's wearing a lot of clothing. She's wearing pretty things. She's wearing delicate things. So she's, Sherman's kind of making a point to say, Judith would not look like this, right? This is a fake representation of Judith, right? This is a fake representation. So then she's exploiting that fakeness in how she portrays Judith in her photo, right? So this is one of the reasons I'm kind of thankful we have a little bit of time. This is a little bit, have to kind of digest this really early in the morning, right? So we have this very fake Judith, right? And then here we have an extremely fake Judith with that strange mask pulled in the hand and that fake makeup, right? So remember that often in the Baroque period, we have that kind of male-female perspective. Remember in Caravaggio, she's all dainty, right? And then Gentileschi, a female painter, she's like really into it when she's slicing off his head. Do we think Sherman's is the male or the female gaze? Why don't you add it in the chat? Do you think this is male or female or neither? What do you think? What do you guys think? It's okay, male, female, neither? Just make a guesstimate. Get a lot of maybe females question mark, right? Maybe females question mark. Because it is ambiguous, right? Because she's definitely not a delicate flower. So I definitely say she's not male. She may be female, but she's not very vicious either, right? So when we look at Sherman and how she's portraying Judith, remember that we need to focus on does she look real? And she doesn't, right? When we look at her clothing, Sherman dressed her in this bright red, sort of like satin, and that red cloth is almost like blood, right? It's kind of like the gore that's absent from most of the portrayals of Judith, right? A lot of the male artists, when they're painting Judith, don't really put the blood and gore that Gentileschi put in hers, right? The clothing reflects the 17th century, right? And then she uses this very cheap mask, right? Very cheap mask in it, and it lacks blood itself. So there's no blood dripping from this mask, right? The lighting, right? The lighting on this makes it look really fake too. Notice how bright the lighting is, right? On her face, right? Everything illuminated. And in the Baroque, right? If we go back to looking at those other Baroque pieces, right? Notice that we have that chiaroscuro, we have tenebrisa, dramatic difference between light and dark. But in this one, it's very bright. Everything is very like spotlight, almost to the point where it's garish. It's like too bright. And then we have the makeup, right? She feels kind of ghost-like. It looks intentionally very pale and very like artificial. And then she like intentionally puts like strong makeup around her eyes and her lips so that she no longer looks like herself. So there's this fakeness that we were just talking about, right? She's meant to not look real. So she's using this strong female persona from history and making it seem like it's fake. Okay? I'm sure she has another series, but the last series I knew about is she was doing socialites, New York socialites. So she was basically a lot of the people who are her patrons. She was doing a series where she was dressing up like them. Okay, any questions on Cindy Sherman? It's kind of a little strange to wrap our brain about. Okay, the next artist we have is Shirin Neshat, and she is a female artist. She is a photographer, she's a videographer, she's a performance artist from Iran. And she made a video and a movie based on the separation of the sexes in Iran. And this is a real famous still from it. Because of timing, I'm not going to watch a video, but maybe later we can do it if we have time, where we can see part of this video, right? So when you look at it, she kind of has a strong sort of central composition, and she is able to divide the sexes, male and female, right through the middle, right? And so this is the piece that's in the 250. It's called Rebellious Silence, and it's from a series of work as well called Women of Allah, right? So it comes from the series Women of Allah. In this image, the artist is Shirin Neshat, but she was not able to take the photo herself. So we have the photo is taken by Cynthia Preston, and the reason being is that this is Shirin Neshat. This is an image of her in this photo. So unlike Cindy Sherman, who uses a lot of timers and like release buttons to take her pictures, Shirin Neshat typically has other people take her photos. So she sets them up. Just like Andy Warhol, she has assistants. Okay. So in Shirin Neshat's work, one of the things that she addresses is the history of where she comes from. And so the Women of Allah series is very much inspired by the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, as well as 9/11, right? So the history that takes place in her own country, as well as what happens in this country on 9/11. And she is in exile from Iran. I have a video we can probably maybe watch at the very end today about where she discusses living in exile and how it made her become even more adamant about the work that she makes. So one of the reasons why she's in exile is, of course, some of the things that you see listed above, but as a female artist who's very outspoken about the atrocities that she sees in her own country, she basically had, feared for her life, left Iran, and has been living in exile ever since. I know she was trying to get back to Iran a couple of years ago, but I honestly don't know if she was able to get back. Right? So in this image, she's playing on stereotypes. Can you guys identify any stereotypes that we have about Islam? Right? So when we think about, if you guys are so young, so 9/11, right, seems like a long time ago in history. But after 9/11, there was a lot of stereotypes and ugly, Zionism against Muslims, and so she was, trying to play on those stereotypes. Do we see any stereotypes in this image? Does anyone have any? Eva, do you see any stereotypes? Can you give me one?
She's wearing what seems like some type of burqa.
So she's got her head covered, and so that's a stereotype that all Muslim women have to wear a head covering. I should know the name of it, but it slipped my mind. Anything else? Oh, is there anything that's maybe post 9/11 imagery that you see? What's she holding? What's that thing going right across the middle of her face? Help me with that one. Can you see what's going right through the middle of her face? Aaron? on her face?
I think it's a rifle.
Yeah, it's a rifle, so we have a gun. Right? Anything else? Remember, when we looked at Islamic art, is there anything from our theme, COG, that we see in this? C being calligraphy, O being organic, arabesque, G being geometric. Katie, can you help me with that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Is there anything from our theme for Islamic art? Remember calligraphy, arabesque, organic, and then geometric, COG?
There's like text across her face.
Exactly. And so she has her veil, her headdress, right? She's got the gun. She has the text, right, which is in calligraphy. And she also has this gaze. And so when we look at her gaze, the gaze is really strong. And some people might actually say it's kind of intimidating, right? And so a lot of people were fearful of Muslims. And so she wanted to play on that. But also, a lot of times people are thinking of women as being submissive in the culture. And so she's kind of playing like, do we think that's a submissive gaze? Right? So she's playing on stereotypes, and she revisits these in the entire series. So when we look at her gaze, do we think she's being confrontational, or do we think that she's being submissive? And there's multiple interpretations to this. So of course, if you were to give yourself an interpretation, you'd want to make sure that you were able to kind of justify it, right? So you have to keep in mind that Shirin Neshat is working in, the West. She's working in like kind of the Western art world. And in art history, right, usually when we see images of women from this part of the world, right, in the Western tradition, they're in the vein of Ams. Remember Ams with our large odalisque? Now she's Turkish, right, not Iranian. But remember that in this, neoclassical romantic period, they did a lot of orientalizing. So they would take these images of women and they would make them, viewable for the Western eyes and make them seem exotic, right? So this image, right, is not like that at all. So she's really making a pointed statement to look directly in the viewer's eye, right? And to really address those stereotypes. So that gives you a little bit of context, right? She's purposely making a statement that's contrary to how we normally perceive Islamic women, either in the art historical past or in contemporary society, right? So with how it's made, right? I had mentioned that she basically has an assistant or a photographer, right? She hires a photographer to take pictures of herself. But when you look at the text, how is it applied, right? How is it applied, and what is the text of, right? So the text is a bunch of poetry made by different Iranian women, right? So it's Iranian poetry. This is some of the best known poetry in the world. And we actually looked at some of that poetry when we were looking at calligraphy and miniature painting at the end of our Islamic unit, right? And so what she did is she used the words of other Iranian women and she paints it on the actual photograph. So this is not written on her face, right? She takes the photo and then they print the photo and then they put the text on top. You probably wrote down the notes, I forgot to add it to this slide too, that different poetry comes from the allegiance of wakefulness. So that's the text that is written across. And often when we think about stereotypes and thinking about the text, some people would have made assumptions because they don't understand the language that is propaganda, that's Islamic rhetoric, that's extremism, that's words you can't understand and it must be aggressive. But in actuality, it's beautiful words, right? It's like the best words that come out of Iran. So here's some other examples. She often puts herself kind of in the center of the composition, so it's very direct and plays on those stereotypes. So this is the TED Talk. I think maybe we'll come back to this, but I want to make sure we get through everything else because we've got another couple of difficult pieces to get through. So we're going to look at investigation of identity. This is the artist, oh golly, Abakanowicz, right? And when you look at this artwork, this is called Back, right? This is called Back. She makes gallery pieces as well as environmental pieces. And so depending on the setting, right, the location, the meaning might change, right? And so when you look at these pieces, how does the setting and the light change the meaning, right? Let's look at the image on the left first. Image on the left first. Well, notice how the light is hitting each of the figures. Varun, can you help me out with this? What does it seem like? Why does the light hit these figures the way that they do? Do you have any guess?
It makes them all seem like they have their heads bowed and looking somewhere.
Right? So they actually have no heads, right? Which is kind of strange. They do look like they're bowed over, right? So they look like they're in the act of bowing. But notice how each of them kind of have their own spotlight on them, right? So it makes it feel like they're all being like emphasized, like, you know, they're being highlighted as individuals. But then when you look at them outdoors, it's almost like you see them as a mass of people. Does that make sense? Because you can't control the lighting outside. So even though it might be the same amount, like this might be just a different photo, it's the same amount of figures, it's just different lighting. It kind of depends on, does it look like it's about a person and their grief or their body kind of crumbling over? Or is it the plight of the mass or the masses, right? So, excuse me, Abakanowicz, her work reflects her upbringing. So she was actually she comes from aristocratic means, actually from the former Soviet Union, and her family had to go to Poland, and they kind of lost their family estate. So she was basically somebody who was very well off, who became very poor. And in her exile from her family land, she actually started to work in hospitals, and she started to notice kind of like what war and exile had done to like the human spirit. And so a lot of her imagery is kind of based on how people are really shells of who they once were, right? They kind of lose their identity. So when you look at the backs from this angle, you notice they have no head, they have no front, they have no torso, right? This is called back, right? So she lived through World War II. The Nazis are the ones who took her family's estate and actually shot her mother. And she used a lot of natural materials in her work. So she intentionally used things that seemed kind of rustic, playing on the idea of the forest in which her family had their estate. So actually, she was from Russia. Right. So here's some examples. You can really see this one, the kind of natural materials that she's incorporated into those figures. Right. And so the one that we have in the 250 is Androgyn, number 3. And so we have two different views of this one. What's the moon on the left? Right? Let's look at the moon on the left. Right? What kind of emotion, or when we look at that, what's kind of our first impression of what's happening to this figure? Juana, can you help me out with this one? Looking at the left, from this view, what's your interpretation of the pose? How would this person feel?
Probably tired.
Tired, right? Their back is hunched over. Do we have any other interpretations? Jeffrey, do you have one? Guy, the one on the left. We've got tired.
I was thinking like dejected.
I'm sorry?
Like dejected.
Right. And so they're dejected, they're devastated, they're sad. We got them kind of hunched over. But notice how from looking at the front, you get a slightly different interpretation. Let's look at the right. Right, look at the right one. Emily, do you have any different interpretation from the backside on this one on the right?
I don't know. It's like they're hunched over. I won't necessarily feel tired. I don't know.
Is there, what's there? Is there anything there?
No.
It's more empty, right? So on the back, you have, it's kind of like full of emotion. It's hunched over. It looks like it's just, it can't kind of go on, right? It's really solemn and sad. And then on the right side, when you see it from the front here, it feels empty, right? So it's like, it's a shell of a person. There's like nothing there. There's an absence of emotion, right? With this one, this is really interesting. Unlike the one we saw of the series of the back, notice how it's not on the floor, right? Does anyone have any ideas why she didn't place this one on the floor? It goes back to her history. Remember that she was a nursing assistant in a hospital in Poland. And so it's reminiscent of like a gurney, or how bodies would be carried off of like the field, like I can't think of the word, right? During war, right? Taking the bodies off of the field. So her process, right? She would use natural materials like we mentioned before. So she used things like burlap, string, and then cotton gauze. Cotton gauze would be used in hospitals. You guys have probably had like a wound wrap with cotton gauze before, right? And what she would do is dip it in resin. Resin is a very hard substance. It's kind of like a very hard sort of plastic. And she would press this gauze that's wrapped in resin into a mold. She actually used the same mold from back series, so the series we've been looking at, to make this piece. So she's reusing that same mold. So it looks like these guys down here, up here. Right? I don't know if you guys seen this piece before. Anyone seen this piece before? It's in Grant Park in Chicago. So this is kind of like a colossal. This one is like a cast of large resin pieces. So these are actually made out of metal, right? But they look like they're made out of the natural pieces. So her work, she has some outdoor pieces, and like I said, this one's in Grant Park. Okay. The last artist we have today is Kiki Smith. And this is another one that's kind of difficult. She too, in her early life, worked in a hospital. And so a lot of her sculptures were basically based kind of like Androgyn 3 that we just saw, on kind of like the shells of people. And so sometimes she hangs people from the ceiling or from poles. She's like their bloody skin hanging from a wall, kind of gross. Emily's face looks a little disgusting at the moment. A lot of her early pieces are based on vulnerability, being vulnerable. And so here we have kind of this young sort of child, kind of like in a fetus position, right? Here we have, bowing down, right? Like placating. And I love the exaggeration of the arms here. It's like over exaggerating that she's bending down for someone. So they're very vulnerable, right? And so these are kind of like her early pieces. They often are very soft in nature too. And then she starts to kind of do the opposite. She starts to make images of strong people, people who aren't necessarily more physically vulnerable. And in that, she does a series based on Genevieve and the May Wolf. This is a story coming out of France. And so in this series, there is a series of female, right, images of women with wolves. And so she often is pairing them together. And so how would you react if you were near a wild wolf? If there was a wild wolf in your room at this moment, how would you feel? Would you be standing as calmly as you see right now? Alana, what do you think?
I would not be as calm as she is.
No, you'd be hiding, you'd be running out the door, right? And so she has kind of these confident females, right, who are near these kind of vicious animals. And I love here that this wild wolf, doesn't he look like man's best friend? He looks like he's a dog, right? He wants to be petted, right, on his belly. And so she not only does, sculptures, but she also does these drawings and prints. And so in her newer works, what she does is she kind of turns everyday objects, people, symbols into mystical creations, right? So this is another one that's a little bit hard to kind of wrap your brain around. So she tells a story. So here we have like a woman being birthed from a deer. Obviously, could happen, right? This is kind of a famous one that she had. I don't know if anyone saw Gilmore Girls, but Lorelai got a very fancy gift from her parents once of Wolf Girl, which was a print of this famous drawing. That's scary, right? So often it's like these, they seem like they're stories, right? They don't seem natural. And so that leads us to the piece that we have, this drawing on paper called Lying with the Wolf. Lying with the Wolf. Okay, so let's just diagnose what we see here. What is the woman doing? What is the woman doing? Any idea? Isabella? What is she doing?
It looks like she's like cuddling with a wolf.
She is. She's like cuddling with a wolf. So this wild wolf, right, is being cuddled with this woman, right? And why is she pairing them here? She wants you to see these people as equals, right? That this woman is fierce. That this woman can be passive too. That the wildness of the wolf can be tamed, right? She wants to show them that they're equal. And she wants to make sure she's making statements against stereotypes and traditional roles where women are typically seen as passive or nurturing, right? Which I think is funny because this actually kind of is like a nurturing scene. She looks like she's cuddling and fooling the wolf, right? So it kind of plays on the stereotype. She's like holding this wild creature that she has made passive. She's taming the wild. Okay, so that is all we have today. There's some information on this in Smart History, but there's not a lot. I have like other information about other pieces, but they don't really help us with this. What I'd like to do is, if you're able to stick around, I really would like to listen to Shirin Neshat talk about her artwork. So this is about 10 minutes long, and then after that we can leave. Sound good?